Legends lied. Those beings descending were actually humans. The first thing that fell was a piece of the engine block. It hit the upper atmosphere of Vorath like a stone thrown at glass and broke into 100 burning pieces. The pieces spread across the night sky in long white lines. From the ground, it looked like the stars were tearing themselves apart. The Vorathi saw it from their stone citadels on the ridgelines. They had been watching the strange light move through their sky for 3 days. Their long-range sight readers had been tracking it since it crossed the outer belt. The Elder Council had debated. The war priests had argued. The scripture readers had gone pale and quiet and pulled out the oldest texts. The oldest texts said this would come. Someday the sky would break, and from the breaking the pale fire's children would descend. They would arrive in destruction. They would carry ruin in their hands. No Vorathi who touched them would survive it. 3,000 years of waiting, and now the sky was on fire. High Warden Das stood on the top wall of the great citadel and watched the burning pieces fall. His ceremonial plating was cold in the night wind. His 6 limbs were very still. He had always believed the texts. He had spent 40 years of his life making sure every young Vorathi believed them too. He watched the fire streak down toward the rocky equatorial belt far below and said nothing. He did not need to say anything. Everyone on the wall already understood. The gods had arrived. Inside the falling ship, 340 people were screaming. Not in terror, in instruction. Rail was already moving through the main corridor, shouting at people to get to the emergency straps, to close the inner doors, to stop standing in the middle of the passage and move. He was a big man, wide in the shoulders, with hands that had spent years pulling heavy salvage lines in deep water. He knew what it felt like when something large and heavy was about to hit something it was not supposed to hit. He knew it in his chest before his brain caught up. He got 12 people strapped before the second engine went. The noise was not like anything he could describe later. It was not an explosion in the way a word describes an explosion. It was the entire frame of the ship deciding to stop being one thing and start being several things. The floor tilted. The lights went red. Someone hit him from the side and he caught them without looking, just grabbed whatever his hand found and held on while the world came apart around them. Dara was already in the medical bay when it happened. She had been there for 6 hours because she had learned, on 3 previous deep transit runs, that the best place to be during a rough entry was somewhere with padding and straps and things to hold. She had already secured the critical equipment. She had already made a list in her head of the injuries that were coming. She had done this before, not a crash exactly, but close enough. She strapped herself in and watched the ceiling crack and did not close her eyes. Closing your eyes did not help. You still had to deal with everything when you opened them. Gustav was in his bunk writing notes. He had been writing notes for 11 hours straight because they had been passing through a debris field that he was very sure was the remnant of some kind of alien structure, and he had not wanted to stop. When the ship began to break apart, he looked up from his notebook, looked at the ceiling, said something short and sharp under his breath, and then, remarkably, tucked the notebook inside his jacket before grabbing the bunk straps. His priorities were consistent, if not sensible. They hit the surface of Vorath on the eastern edge of the equatorial belt. The ship did not land so much as it stopped falling in the least catastrophic way physics would allow. 3 sections broke off on the way down. One hit a canyon wall and was gone. One landed in a river system somewhere far to the north. The main hull skidded across a flat stone plain for almost 2 kilometers before it stopped against a ridge of dark crystalline rock. Silence came after. Then the sounds of fire and metal settling and people. Rail pulled himself out of the wreckage through a split in the hull and stood in the open air of an alien world for the first time. The air was thinner than earth but breathable. It tasted like cold stone and something faintly sweet that he had no name for. The sky above was beginning to lighten toward a pale gold dawn. The ground under his boots was dark rock, flat and hard, and around him in every direction were the shattered pieces of the life he had been living 2 hours ago. He counted survivors for the next 4 hours. 41 dead in the crash, 19 more badly wounded, 280 people sitting in the open air of a world that had no name in any human atlas, doing the basic human work of figuring out what came next. Dara moved through the wounded with quiet hands and very few words. Gustav stood at the edge of the debris field looking at the ridgeline with his notebook already open again. Rail let him. There were bigger problems. The bigger problem was this: something was moving on the ridge. Not animals. The movement was too deliberate, too organized. It stopped when he looked at it and started again when he looked away. Whatever was up there had been watching since before the sun came up. He stood very still and looked directly at the ridge for a long time. The shapes on the ridge went completely still. Then one of them made a sound, low and resonant, like a bell struck underwater, and all of them retreated back over the ridge and were gone. Rail stood in the alien morning and stared at the empty ridgeline for a while. Then he went back to help carry the wounded. There was a lot of work to do. The shapes came back the next morning. Rail had slept 3 hours on a piece of hull plating with his jacket folded under his head. He had set 4 people on watch rotation through the night. None of them had seen anything. But in the first pale light of the Vorathi dawn, the shapes were back on the ridge again, still and watching, like they had been there all night and simply decided to let themselves be seen. He told nobody. He picked up his water container, took a long drink, and started walking toward the ridge. His left leg had been torn open by a strip of hull panel during the crash. Dara had stitched it closed with a portable kit and told him firmly not to stress it for at least a week. He had nodded at the time. He was stressing it now. It pulled and burned with every uphill step, but he kept his pace slow and even, not because of the leg, but because he did not want whatever was up there to think he was charging at them. He kept his hands open and slightly away from his body. It was a gesture that meant nothing to any creature that had never seen a human before, but it was the only thing he had. The shapes watched him come. They did not run. They did not make the low bell sound again. They simply watched with the kind of total stillness that Rail recognized from deep water work, the stillness of something deciding whether to stay or go. With every second the answer could change. He stopped about 40 meters from the tree line. The alien trees had thin silver trunks and flat pale leaves that moved slightly in a wind he could not feel down on the plain. The shapes were in the shadow between the trunks. He could see them more clearly now. Tall, multi-limbed, eyes that picked up the low morning light and returned it faintly like polished stone. He sat down on the ground. It was not a strategic decision. His leg was hurting and sitting down was the most non-threatening thing he could think of. That was not lying flat on his back, which seemed like a bad idea. One of the shapes shifted, just slightly, a movement that was not retreat and not advance, a recalculation. Rail waited. He was very good at waiting. Deep salvage work was mostly waiting, waiting for current to shift, waiting for visibility to clear, waiting for a creak in a structure to either become a collapse or settle back into silence. He had spent whole days underwater waiting for the right moment. 40 meters of open ground and a tree line full of alien creatures watching him with religious terror was honestly not that different. After a long while he stood up slowly, nodded once at the tree line for no reason he could explain, and walked back to camp. That afternoon, Oveth made a mistake. Not a large mistake, just a young scout's mistake, the kind made by someone who had been told their whole life that a thing was monumentally dangerous and had therefore never learned to properly judge its actual danger, only its legend. Oveth had been tracking the crash survivors through the canyon system east of the shipwreck, moving carefully, staying downwind, recording everything on a waxstone tablet. The scout was good at this, small and quiet and patient. What Oveth had not accounted for was the human woman moving in the opposite direction, through the same canyon, for completely separate reasons. Dara had gone looking for a specific type of rock. She had seen a mineral deposit through the canyon wall on her way to check on a survivor's camp location and recognized it as a possible antiseptic source. She had read papers about similar mineral formations on two other surveyed worlds, and the chemical profile was close enough to be worth investigating. She was in a narrow section of the canyon with her eyes on the rock wall when she stepped around a large boulder and almost walked directly into Ovith. For 1 second, nothing happened. Ovith was completely frozen. Every piece of scripture, every lesson, every story ever told by every elder and war priest said, if a god of the pale fire touches you, you cease to exist. Ovith was so close that the human woman could have reached out and touched the scout without even taking a step. The secondary limbs had locked. The crystalline eyes were as wide as they could physically go. The wax stone tablet fell on the ground and nobody moved to pick it up. Dara looked at the creature in front of her. 6 limbs, exoskeleton the color of slate, eyes like broken geodes that caught the light from a dozen angles, about the height of a tall teenager. The posture was terror. She had seen that posture in 100 different species of animals, and it was always the same, completely still because movement might trigger the end of everything. She took one very careful step back. She said, quietly and evenly as if it might somehow matter, "I'm not going to hurt you." Ovith did not understand the words, but the tone, low, unhurried, the way a sound moves when the thing making it is not preparing to attack, that landed somewhere older than language. Ovith's secondary limbs unlocked slightly. Then Dara noticed that Ovith's lower right limb was at a bad angle, not from their almost collision. Old damage, maybe a fall in the canyon system. The exoskeleton was cracked along a joint, and the limb was being held up and away from the ground in the careful way that meant weight on it was pain. She did not think about it. She sat down on the ground, opened her kit, and looked at the limb with the professional attention of someone who had been setting broken things for 20 years. Ovith stood completely still and watched a god of destruction take out small metal tools and begin, with extraordinary care, to fix something. The waxstone tablet lay forgotten on the canyon floor. Neither of them picked it up for a long time. Word travels fast in small communities and faster, still in communities held together by fear. By the time Ovith limped back to the Citadel outer wall that evening, 3 other scouts had already sent reports to the war priests. The gods were building structures from the wreckage of their sky vessel. The gods were moving in small groups through the canyon systems. The gods had small, controlled fire that they carried in flat metal containers and used to cook their food. And one god had sat down on the ground outside the tree line and waited for a very long time before simply walking away. War Priest Svek read each report twice. He was young for his rank, not yet 40 seasons, which in Vorathi terms meant he was still considered to be in the dangerous phase of his thinking, old enough to have authority, young enough to still ask questions that the older priests had stopped asking. His senior, the High Warden Das, had told him more than once that questions were for scholars, not war priests. War priests had answers. The texts provided the answers. The texts had always provided the answers. Svek had always found the text slightly incomplete on specifics. He went out that night and found Ovith sitting alone near the eastern grain storage, away from the other scouts. The lower right limb was wrapped in something that was not Vorathi cloth. It was a paler, finer material, tied in a pattern that no Vorathi hand would naturally make. Svek looked at the wrapping for a long time. Then he sat down next to Ovith and said nothing. He was good at waiting too, in his own way. Ovith talked for a long time, about the woman, about the tools, about the way she had sat down first, making herself smaller before she came close, about the fact that she had made a sound the whole time she worked, not words exactly, just a low continuous sound, rhythmic and even, the way Vorathi mothers made sound to young ones in the dark. About the way she had looked at the limb, with a specific focused expression that Ovith had eventually recognized, after a long time of thinking about it, as the expression of someone solving a problem they have solved many times before and are confident they can solve again. Svek wrote everything down in his secondary notebook, the one he kept inside his ceremonial plating where no one checked. Then he went to the records room and pulled the oldest version of the founding text, not the copied version, not the translated version. The original, kept in a sealed case of cured shell, pressed into flat clay panels in the original carved-root script that almost no one in the Citadel could still read fluently. Svek could read it. He had learned it in secret, at age 12, from an elderly scholar who had thought it was the most important thing a young Vorathi could know. He read the passage about the pale fire's children 3 times. Then he sat very still for a while, looking at the clay panel. Then he wrote something in his secondary notebook and closed it. Meanwhile, Gustav had made what he considered to be the most exciting discovery of his career, which was already a career full of exciting discoveries. He had found, in a shallow depression near the ship's wreckage, a piece of carved stone, not shaped by weather, shaped by a tool, clean edges, deliberate geometry, a series of marks along one face that repeated at a pattern interval of exactly 3. He had picked it up with both hands and turned it over 6 times, and then had to sit down, because his legs went unreliable with excitement. He brought it to Dara, who looked at it carefully and said it looked intentional. He brought it to Rael, who looked at it and said something that the children in Rael's family had apparently heard frequently, which was a short phrase indicating that things had become significantly more complicated. Gustav had begun building a chart in his notebook. On one side, sounds. On the other side, context. He had been recording every sound he could hear from the ridgeline and canyon areas where the shapes moved, noting the time of day, the activity visible before or after the sound, the direction and apparent source. He had 11 pages. He had a preliminary theory. The theory was that the tonal language used by the Vorathi, he had named them Vorathi in his notes because he needed to call them something, operated on a frequency range that human ears could detect but not fully distinguish, like trying to identify individual instruments in a piece of music played at the edge of your hearing. He needed a test subject, ideally a willing one. Oveth came back to the canyon the next day. This time not by accident. The young scout stood at the edge of the crash site, in the open, visible, which was apparently a significant act of something. Gustav could not tell if it was courage or desperation or religious crisis, but it was deliberate. Dara walked out slowly to meet Oveth. She brought water and a piece of the dried food from their rations, which she placed on the ground between them and did not reach for again. Oveth looked at the food for a long time. Then Oveth reached out with a primary upper limb, picked it up, and smelled it with the sensory cluster near the base of the jaw, made a complex expression that Gustav, watching from 20 meters away with his notebook, annotated as ambiguous but not hostile, set it back down carefully. Then Oveth reached into a pouch in the joint of the lower shell and produced something, a small flat piece of wax stone. On it was pressed a simple picture, a figure with 2 limbs sitting on the ground, a second figure with 6 limbs standing nearby, and something being passed between them. Dara looked at the picture. Then she looked up at Oveth. Then she smiled slowly, which was a facial expression she had no way of knowing was completely outside of Vorathi biological capability, but which Oveth somehow, some instinctive ancient way, read as safe. Gustav was already writing faster than he had written anything in his life. The word system that Gustav and Oveth built together did not look like a language at first. It looked like a mess. There were pages of drawings, hundreds of wax stone impressions, a vocabulary of 43 sounds that Oveth had established and Gustav had done his best to transliterate into human script, though 4 of them were in frequency ranges he could detect but not reproduce, so he had named them by color in his notes: blue word, deep red word, the one he called greylow that seemed to mean something between regret and caution. He could hear them. He could write approximately where they sat in a tonal scale. He could not make them. His throat was the wrong shape. Oveth found this fascinating and slightly funny. Gustav knew it was funny because Oveth made a specific rapid clicking with the upper jaw when watching him try, and the scouts who sometimes appeared at the edge of the meeting point made the same sound when Oveth described it to them later. Gustav wrote in his notes, "Laughter universal, possibly. Investigate." The meetings happened every second day in the canyon, then every day. Rail started coming. He said nothing for the first 3 sessions, just sat and watched, which Oveth seemed to find less alarming than Gustav's constant talking. Rail had that quality, he could be completely present and make almost no noise about it. On the 4th session, he produced a folded piece of hull insulation and a piece of carbon from the burned engine. He drew a map. The crash site, the canyon, the ridge, the citadel shape he had seen on the horizon. He showed it to Oveth and pointed at the citadel shape and looked at Oveth with a question on his face. Oveth looked at the map for a long time. Then Oveth took the carbon from Rail's hand very carefully and added to the map. More structures further north. A river. A second settlement near what appeared to be a mountain range. Symbols in the carved root script next to each one that Gustav immediately started trying to decode. They had a map now, a shared one, that changed things. Bren noticed the meetings on the 6th day and said they were a security risk. Bren was not wrong about security risks as a general subject. He had spent 12 years in corporate resource security on 3 different survey worlds, and he knew what happened when a space-faring company made contact with a pre-industrial civilization without proper protocols. He had seen it twice. Neither time had ended well for the civilization. He was trying to prevent that outcome in his way. His way just happened to be the wrong one for this situation, which he had not yet figured out. He came to Rail with 4 of the others and laid out his argument carefully. They did not know if the creatures were hostile. They did not know the population size or military capacity. Making regular contact with a single individual created dependency and vulnerability. They should establish a perimeter, wait for the rescue signal to get a response, and let the proper contact teams handle it when they arrived. Rail listened to all of it. Then he said, "Dara fixed a broken limb. Gustav is building a dictionary. Oveth has given us a map of the northern settlements that we did not have before. The proper contact teams, when they come, will need all of that. We are the proper contact team right now. We are all there is." Bren did not like this answer. He went away with his group, and they kept their distance from the canyon meetings, but they also did not interfere, which Rail considered acceptable for now. On the 9th day, Oveth brought something new. It was a small clay panel, old, the edges worn smooth from handling. On it was pressed the original carved root script, the same script Gustav had seen on the carved stone he found near the wreckage. Oveth set it on the ground between them and pointed at it, then pointed at the citadel shape on their shared map, then made a sequence of sounds that Gustav had enough vocabulary to partially follow. Old, given, important. A word he had marked as blue word, the one he could not reproduce, which he had tentatively translated as something that meant either sacred or very, very old or possibly both. Gustav looked at the panel with the specific expression he wore when something exceeded his ability to stay calm about it. Then Oveth pointed at the panel, pointed at Gustav's notebook, and made a gesture that Gustav had learned meant, "Take this, it is for you." He took it with both hands. He held it the way you hold something that might break if you are not careful. He said thank you in the gray-low register that meant something close to gratitude, his attempt at it rough and approximate. Oveth made the rapid upper jaw click again, but softer, gentler than the laughter at his pronunciation failures. Something different. Rail, watching, thought it sounded like the thing someone does when they are moved by something and do not want to show it too plainly. It took Gustav 4 days to translate the panel. He did it by comparing the carved root script marks to the vocabulary list he and Oveth had built, cross-referencing the tonal notes, filling in the gaps with contextual logic the way you reconstruct a broken sentence from surviving words. He was not certain of everything, but he was certain of enough. He brought his translation to Rael and Dara that evening. The panel was a fragment of the founding text, the passage about the Pale Fire's children, their arrival in burning sky, their survival of wounds that should kill, their strange power, their unstoppable nature. Rael read it, then he read it again. Then he said, "Well, we did arrive in fire." Dara said, "We are hard to kill." Gustav said, "The original word for the children of the Pale Fire, in the root script, it does not mean destroyer. I have checked it 6 times now. It means survivor of the breaking of the sky. Someone at some point in the last 3,000 years decided those were the same thing. They are not the same thing at all." The 3 of them sat with that for a while. Outside, the alien stars were coming out one by one in the darkening sky. From somewhere on the ridge, very faint, came the low, resonant bell sound of a Vorathi settlement going quiet for the night. Rael looked at the clay panel in his hands and thought about all the things that a legend could get wrong about a person before that person ever arrived to correct it. He thought there might be a way forward here, a real one. The canal ran through the eastern edge of the outer settlement like a scar in the rock, deep, fast, pale blue from the mineral content of the mountain runoff that fed it. It was the oldest structure in the Citadel complex, older than the walls, older than the carved gate arches. The Vorathi had built everything else around it. Rael had noticed it on the shared map. He had asked about it through Oveth, and Oveth had explained that it was a sacred waterway, one of the reasons the Citadel was built in that specific place. The water came from the high peaks and moved fast enough to stay clean all year. The Vorathi used it for drinking, for irrigation, for the ceremonial water offerings made at the start of each season. What they did not use it for, Oveth explained carefully with a combination of gesture and vocabulary, was entering. The current was too strong, the depth too uncertain, and the exoskeletal structure of Vorathi bodies meant that once in, getting out without a very specific mechanical lift at the designed extraction points was nearly impossible. Falling in the wrong section meant being carried to a waterfall drop 3 kilometers downstream. The children were not supposed to play near the outer edge, where the stone lip was low and unguarded. Rael filed this information and forgot it almost immediately, because there were 17 more pressing things to deal with that week. The meeting with the Elder Council had been arranged by Oveth after Svek brought the issue to Elder Merv through a back channel that bypassed Das entirely. Merv was old, pragmatic, and had been quietly suspicious of certain sections of the founding text for 30 years without saying so publicly. The young war priest's secondary notebook, which Svek had finally shown to Merv in private, had made her suspicious of several more sections. She had arranged the meeting in 2 days' time. The humans would enter through the outer gate. No weapons, Oveth would translate. The day before the meeting, Bren made his move. He had been building toward it for some time, gathering the people in his group who felt that patience was a form of weakness, and that any intelligent species who had not yet made hostile contact was simply one that had not yet found the opportunity. He had identified a Vorathi supply structure at the outer settlement edge, grain storage and dried fiber stores, visible from the canyon. His argument to his group was that they needed resources. They were entitled to survival, and waiting for permission was a luxury they could not afford. He did not expect the 4 Vorathi workers inside the storage structure to be there in the middle of the afternoon. The confrontation was not a battle. It was a collision of misunderstandings, Bren's group pushing inside a space that belonged to someone else, the workers alarmed and responding with the defensive posture of people who had been told their whole lives that contact meant death, but were now discovering they were not immediately dead, which left them confused and frightened and reacting badly. 2 of Bren's people were hurt by the defensive limb response of a panicking Vorathi. 2 of the workers were hurt when they tried to leave through an exit that was blocked. Rael heard it from across the settlement perimeter and was moving before he had finished processing what the sounds meant. He came through the structure door and put himself between Bren's group and the four Vorathi workers with the simple physical fact of being a large person standing in the way. He did not raise his hands. He did not shout. He said to Bren, at a volume that was completely level, "Stop. Right now." Bren stopped, not because he was afraid of Rael, because Rael's voice in that register carried a quality that Bren recognized from resource security work. The voice of someone who had already decided what was going to happen and was giving the other party a moment to agree before it happened without their input. Dara was already inside, moving toward the injured workers with her kit. Oveth had appeared at the door. Rael did not know how Oveth had gotten there that fast, but Oveth was there, speaking to the workers in the rapid Vorathi tone that Gustav had annotated as urgent reassurance. Rael looked at Bren for a long moment. Then he said, "This is done. You are done with decisions that affect everyone else here. Go back to the camp." Bren went. His group went with him. Rael stood in the storage structure doorway until they were out of sight. Then he turned to Oveth and said, in the partial Vorathi vocabulary he had been quietly building from Gustav's notes, "My fault. I am sorry. This does not happen again." His pronunciation was not good, but the words were right, and Oveth confirmed this with a slow tilt of the upper body that Gustav had marked as acknowledgement received, weight given. The next morning Rael went to the Elder Council meeting alone. He had discussed it with Dara and Gustav. All three of them should have gone, but after the supply structure incident, Rael thought that one person accepting responsibility clearly was more useful than three people sharing it in a way that could look like deflection. He told Gustav to stay close to Oveth. He told Dara to keep working. He walked through the outer gate of the citadel for the first time with his hands visible and his pace slow and Oveth at his side. The gate was carved stone, very old, with symbols in the root script that he could not read. He was aware of a large number of Vorathi watching from windows and upper walkways and the narrow passages between structures. None of them moved. He kept walking. The council chamber was deep inside the citadel, cool and dim and smelling of old stone and the waxy substance the Vorathi used to treat their ceremonial plating. 5 elders in formal coverings. Das at the head of the table, expression unreadable. Merv to one side with her primary limbs folded, watching. Rael sat down. Oveth stood beside him and began translating before anyone spoke. The first question the council asked was, "Why did you not destroy us when you arrived?" Rael thought about this carefully and then said the truth, which was that they had been trying not to die and had not had time for anything else. There was a very long silence after Oveth translated this. Then Elder Merv made a sound that Gustav was not present to document, but that Rael thought, somehow, sounded like someone exhaling a very old and heavy burden. The meeting went on for 2 hours. At the end of it, nothing was decided, but nothing was broken either. And in Rael's experience, that was almost always where everything real began. The child's name was Tev, 6 seasons old, the youngest sibling of Svek, the war priest who had been writing secret notes in a hidden notebook since the humans arrived. Tev had been told 40 times not to go near the outer canal lip. Tev had the quality that youngest siblings across all known species appear to share, which is that instructions given 40 times are heard as background noise rather than direction. It was midday. Most of the citadel was inside. The canal edge was unguarded. The stone lip was wet. Tev was small. The rest followed from those 2 facts. The sound Tev made going in carried further than any adult sound would have, high and sharp, and cut off fast by the water. Rael was on the outer settlement path with a group of survivors doing a material carry, hull plating being relocated to build a better shelter for the injured. He heard it. He was already running before the first Vorathi adult reached the canal edge and stopped, unable to enter, staring at the small shape being taken by the current. He did not think about it. There was no thought involved. There was a child in the water, and he was a person who spent 12 years underwater, and both of those facts left no space for a third fact of any kind. He went in. The water was cold, cold enough to take the breath fast, and the current was strong, much stronger than it looked from the bank. He went under, found the surface, got oriented, and started swimming toward the shape ahead of him. His left leg pulled badly, and he used it less and focused on the right side in his arms, which were fine, which had pulled weighted salvage lines through deep crosscurrents and knew what to do. He reached Tev after about 30 seconds. Tev was fighting the water in the panic-thrashing way of someone who has not yet decided whether to inhale or not. Rail got an arm under the small body, got the face clear of the water, and switched to a cross-current swim toward the near bank. His boots were heavy. His leg was burning. He hit the bank at an angle and grabbed the fitted stone edge with one hand and held, the current pulling at both of them, until two Vorathi hands, primary limbs, strong, reaching down from the bank, grabbed his arm and helped haul Tev up first and then him. He lay on the stone canal edge breathing for a moment. He was cut along the right shoulder from the fitted stone. His leg bandage had come loose, and blood was mixing with the water still running off him. He was fine. He sat up after a few seconds because lying down did not help anything. Tev was coughing and crying and obviously going to survive. A Vorathi adult, Svek, as it turned out, was making the rapid, urgent sounds of a sibling who has had the most frightening moment of their life. Rail pushed the wet hair out of his face with both hands and looked at Tev carefully until Dara arrived, because Dara always arrived, and took over with the kit. He became aware that there were a great many Vorathi standing around him in complete silence. Not afraid, not retreating, just still, looking at him the way people look when they have seen something that does not fit into any category they already have. Svek looked at Rail for a long moment. Then the war priest made a sound, not a Vorathi word, something shorter, something from the older register. Gustav, who had come running and arrived only slightly after Dara, annotated it later as a sound made in the presence of something that changes what you believe to be true. High Warden Das was on the citadel wall. He had seen all of it. He went back inside and did not come out for 3 days. When he came out, he called a full council session. He came with the sealed clay case from the records room, the one containing the original founding text. He opened it in front of the full council for the first time in recorded history. He read from the original Carved-root script. He read the passage about the pale fire's children. Then he pointed at the specific word that Gustav had also found and translated in his copy of the fragment. He said that the word meant survivor of the breaking of the sky, that the copy made 3,000 years ago had translated it as destroyer, that this was not a small error, that the entirety of the rite of appeasement, the 40 protocols of divine distance, the war priest doctrine of armed readiness against the descending gods, all of it had been built on one word that a tired copyist had misread 30 centuries ago. The council chamber was very quiet. Then Elder Merv said, "So what do we do now?" Das was quiet for a while. Then he said, "We do what should have been done before the error was made. We find out who they are." A season passed. The human settlement at the outer citadel wall grew tidier and more permanent. A Vorathi craftsman had come one afternoon, without announcement, and wordlessly improved the drainage on the shelter structures. Rail had watched him work and then helped without being asked, and they had spent 4 hours working side by side in companionable silence, communicating entirely through the logic of construction. The craftsman had made the upper jaw click when he left. Rail had understood by then that it was a good sound. Gustav finished the full dictionary, 260 words in both directions. He presented a copy to Oveth, who held it for a very long time. The distress beacon had received a relay response. A deep survey vessel had caught the signal 7 weeks ago and rerouted. It would arrive in under 2 years. The survivors had been told. Most of them had discussed it among themselves and arrived individually and separately, at the same conclusion. They were staying through the formal contact period. No extraction fleet was arriving to this world without people on the ground who already knew the Vorathi, already had relationships here, already knew what this place was before anyone with corporate interests decided what it should become. Bren's group took a relay shuttle when it passed through. No ceremony. Rail told them to travel well. He meant it. Some situations require people who approach them Bren's way. This one had not been that situation, but somewhere there was probably one that was. The canal ceremony was held at dawn on the first day of the new season. Svek had written the new scripture. He had a gift for theological language that no one, including Svek, had previously suspected. Elder Merv had approved it. Das had requested one revision, a single word changed in the second passage, and then approved it also. The full citadel attended. The humans stood in the crowd, among the Vorathi, which was still strange and still required patience on all sides and was also completely real. Gustav was writing in his notebook. Dara had 3 Vorathi patients waiting for her after the ceremony and was already thinking about them. Rail stood still and listened. Das read from the new panel in the old ceremonial register. Oveth translated quietly into Rail's ear, one limb resting against his shoulder in the Vorathi gesture that meant, in the loosest possible translation, "You are known here." The new text said, "The legends told of beings who fall from the sky in fire and survive. The legends did not say what they would do when they landed. That part we had to learn ourselves." Somewhere in the pre-dawn sky above, invisible and patient, the distress beacon pulsed its steady signal outward into the dark, telling the universe where they were, telling it that people were here, alive, waiting. There was no hurry. The universe could take its time. They had things to do.